Friends, on behalf of the Dean and Chapter of Westminster, it's a huge joy to welcome you to Westminster Abbey this evening. The Eric Symes Abbott Lecture is a partnership between Keble College, Oxford, King's College, London, and Westminster Abbey, three institutions in which Eric Abbott pursued a distinguished and powerful ministry. I first heard the name of Eric Abbott well before I came to Westminster Abbey and well before I was a priest. A great friend of my grandmother was one of the very many young clergy inspired by Eric Abbott, so much that he kept a photograph of him on his desk right into his late 90s. Eric Abbott was, as his burial stone attests, pastor pastorum. This year, as we gather to celebrate Eric Abbott's memory and his legacy, by exploring the kind of material which mattered to him, we should also remember his great friend and founding trustee of our committee, John Robson, who died just a few months ago. So tonight we gather for this lecture alongside one another, but conscious of those who surely celebrate on another shore and in a greater light. How could fellow pilgrims of Dean Eric Abbott be anything other than welcome in this house of God and house of kings? It's a real joy to introduce our lecturer this evening, Rhidian Brook, who is an award-winning writer of fiction, television drama, and film. Rhidian is known to countless Brits for his perceptive and profound contributions to Radio 4's Thought for the Day and in so many other arenas of our national literary life. He will speak to us under the tantalizing and I know personal theme of writing in good faith, a pilgrimage in fiction, film, and thought. Please join me in welcoming Rhidian Brook.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you all for making this pilgrimage. Over the years, I've written words for short stories, novels, scripts, thoughts, more recently a libretto, and I once wrote copy for the back of a cereal packet, including the line, "You are what you oat." But this is my first lecture. Robots tell me that a 40-minute lecture is about 5,500 words. That's roughly a chapter of Dickens, 2 short stories by Chekhov, 3 sermons if you're an Anglican, half a sermon if you're a Welsh Baptist, and it's roughly 12 thoughts for the day in a row. The exits are there. If this was on ITV, there'd be an ad break at the 23-minute mark for you to make a cup of tea. That's not in the programme, but to honour Eric Abbott's pastoral intent, I'll let you know when we get there. I've also structured this lecture as a 6-part mini-series to help you stay awake. I want to do a couple of things, although in Wales a couple of things can mean anything up to 12, to talk about faith and writing about faith, and the challenges of doing this. I'll be drawing on my own experience and a cloud of brilliant witnesses to make me look good. I've called the lecture Writing in Good Faith, a pilgrimage in fiction, film, and thought. The phrase in good faith sounds almost quaint in a world where it is getting harder to assume it from people or institutions. But I am going to assume it from you, and I hope you will assume it from me. I use the word pilgrimage advisedly. Writing is a kind of faith journey, precariously balanced between success and failure, your hopes swinging between ecstasy and doubt, accolade and abyss, with a long, hard trudge in between, what the novelist Murakami calls a marathon of words. Then, just when you feel like giving up, someone with more faith than you picks you up, encourages you to keep going, and reminds you this is not a solo sport. Although if any of you are thinking of embarking on a career in writing, I have a pastoral care of duty to dissuade you. Don't do it. I sincerely hope this lecture gives you something that will have made your pilgrimage here worth it. It also gives me the chance to boost my flagging back catalogue while simultaneously saying something about the God without whom I would not be standing here. The lecture has been rated 15, containing scenes of a sexual nature, mild drug use, allusions to violence, thinly disguised proselytizing, and possible heresy. It is based on a true story, or, to quote Billy Pilgrim, the hero of Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, all this happened more or less. Episode 1, Witness. If there is any value in hearing writers talk, it will be hearing what they can witness to and not what they can theorize about. So wrote the American writer Flannery O'Connor, and I agree with her. That said, sharing what you can witness to is not easy, especially in the slippery world of words and the liminal world of faith and the fog of fading memory. Faith is deeply felt and yet hard to define. Words slip around and over the subject. It can feel more real than life itself, and yet the moment you try and pin it down and describe it, it flies away, and in your panic, you end up reducing it to an argument, a formula, or a set of rules. In his first letter, St. Peter wrote, "Always be prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect." Of course, these days people give reasons for their beliefs without always waiting to be asked, and usually with little gentleness or respect. Right now, it feels there are Manic Street preachers standing at every corner, forcing their creeds upon us. I once attempted to preach on the district line. I had been angered by a preacher screaming at the commuters, and I thought I could do a better job. It was an excruciating experience, both for me and for the baffled passengers. I spent so much time apologizing for what I was about to do. I left myself 30 seconds of the 90 between stops to deliver the good news. I learned a couple of things that day. Firstly, the tube train is not my medium. Secondly, get your story straight. If you're going to deliver good news, make sure you know what the news is. The gospel, literally good news from the Greek, so often sounds like terrible news, or five parts bad, 4 parts confusing, and 1 part quite good. How to change this ratio? The third thing I learned was that you cannot, and of course never should, coerce anyone into faith. Delivering a message is pointless unless people are able to hear it. I would not be standing in this esteemed pulpit had I not myself once been able to hear it. For the truth is, dear listeners, I had been one of those passengers, head down in my book, trying to get home as the screamed word of God flew over my head. So how did I get to hear it? And what was it that I heard? To answer this, I need to tell you a short story. Episode 2, Conversion. There was once a young man who, at the age of 25, had not settled upon a particular creed or conviction, or what some people back then, in the 1980s, were calling a worldview. If he had a creed, it would have been, if it feels good, do it. And in 1989, there was plenty to feel good about. The Berlin Wall had just fallen. Democracy had won. This was the end of history. Who needs God when humanity is doing so well? Life was full of beautiful distraction. He had a fun, decently paid job in advertising. Soul to Soul was soundtracking the second summer of love. There was a new TV show called The Simpsons, and Die Hard was available on VHS. Someone had once told him that the world was his oyster, and he tucked in. It hadn't yet occurred to him that there might be a pearl. As a boy, he'd heard stories in a place called church about a God who came in person, died, and rose again. He'd seen the face of this God on the telly in a series called Jesus of Nazareth. He looked nice. It was a compelling tale, but just one of many in a world full of stories. There was certainly no connection he could see between this story and those questions that sometimes kept him awake at night. Why is there something, not nothing? Why am I here? Where will I be when I am not me? By the time he was a student, those questions had been settled by science, psychology, and philosophy. The explanations offered by religion were just so much magical thinking. He hardly knew anyone who believed in God, except his girlfriend, who even described herself as Christian. Why would anyone admit such a thing? Anyway, it didn't put him off. He was in love, and apart from Jesus, her real guy, he loved the things she loved. But those questions about existence, the first-order questions, he'd later learned to call them, did not go away. No amount of trying to have a good time could mask an underlying anxiety. A restless neediness created a feeling there must be greener grass somewhere, and he went looking for it. He found himself in the West Indies, but even in paradise, he couldn't escape his own unsatisfactoriness. The words of the prophet Bob Marley chimed, "You think you're in heaven when you're living in hell." As a lucky talisman, he'd taken the as-yet unread Bible that the now ex-girlfriend had given him. One night, he read the Gospels of Mark and John, stories half familiar, half heard in a dim place called church, came at him fully lit and clearly amplified. As he read, he thought, why has no one told me about this? They actually had, he just hadn't been able to hear it. This God had something to say about his deepest fears and his highest hopes. It sounded like good news. That week, he was hospitalized after a drug-induced panic attack. He woke to find the owner of his guest house checking that he was okay. When the owner offered to pray for him, the young man accepted, not expecting the man to pray right there as though his God was in the room. What should have felt awkward felt right. What was supernatural was somehow natural. The young man felt the dead weight of fear lift, replaced by a peace he couldn't explain, a peace the drugs, sunshine, and sea had failed to deliver. Whilst recovering, the young man was invited to a place called church. There he met a handful of people in a tin shack. They were not rich or sophisticated, but they were kind. They seemed to believe the words being read by the old lady at the front. They seemed words that spoke of an outrageous hope that there is a God who is with us and who loves us with a love we can't earn and knows us with a depth we can't fathom. The words seemed to be asking, "Do you believe me?" And without really knowing what he was doing, the young man said yes. Episode 3, Writer. When I returned from that trip, for yes, dear attentive listeners, you will have surmised that young man was I felt a bit like Rutger Hauer in Ridley Scott's Blade Runner when he says, "I've seen things you people wouldn't believe." I had not seen attack ships on fire over the shoulder of Orion, but I believed I had glimpsed another world, encountered something beautiful, and been changed in some profound way. The bad news, initially for friends and family, was that I quickly drew a universal conclusion from my personal experience. What was good news for me surely had to be good news for everyone. I was like an annoying lover, earnest, deaf to how others might perceive my enthusiasm. I became a little God-botherer. Although St. Francis instructs believers to preach the gospel at all times and use words as a last resort, this faith seemed to be all about words, written, spoken, and thought, and it compelled a seeking to understand itself, its object, its place in the world. The theologian Austin Farrer puts it this way: if God is in your life, he is in all things. You must be able to spread the area of your recognition for him and the basis of your conviction about him as widely as your thought and imagination will range. My imagination took me to St. Paul, who on his way to Damascus was royally ambushed, blinded, and unhorsed. Curiously, in his own writings, Paul says very little about this famous encounter. Instead, he spent the rest of his life trying to interpret what it might mean for others. It would turn out that his revelation was not a one-off event, or even the most important thing about his faith. I hadn't lost my vision, but I was blindsided, for I immediately became ill with a viral condition that would lay me low for nearly 2 years. Long enough to think about who it was that had knocked me off my high horse, and to read anything that might help me understand my situation. This forced interiority at least gave me opportunity to look for some internal coherence. In the Confessions of St. Augustine, I read the story of a good-time boy who ate too many oysters, discovered the pearl, and was then able to describe the essence of this pearl. He synthesized his personal story with that of his newfound faith in the most daring and intimate way. He also wrote something that became the first yellow post-it note on my Amstrad when I started writing. Seek not to understand what you may believe, but believe that you might understand. It was an idea that ran counter to everything I had been taught, but it made, and continues to make, perfect sense. I was about to discover what John Newman called the grammar of assent. This idea that your yes gives you the language to understand, speak, and write about faith, and helps you see things in unexpected ways. The Bible was one of these unexpected things. They say never judge a book by its cover, and it's true. Behind the dead black leather, I discovered a living text, whole worlds of existential complaint, philosophic argument, stories within stories, poetry, satire, prophecy. It was both a meditation on the problem of evil and threaded through with a radical narrative of love. And it continued to speak directly to my situation. Even young men who grow faint will be restored, it said to me as I lay on my sickbed. Naturally, I grabbed at that promise and held it tightly. By now, I was reading anything that spoke of meaning, or its opposite. I started with the big Russians, who I discovered weren't afraid to put faith and doubt at the heart of their storytelling. In the introduction to Crime and Punishment, I came across the words of Dostoevsky after his last-minute reprieve before a firing squad, and later put into the mouth of that novel's hero, Raskolnikov. Now my life will change. I shall be born again in a new form. As Dostoevsky boarded the train, convict train, to Siberia, a woman handed him a New Testament. He would come to see its central figure as central not just to his life, but to everyone's. This faith seemed to give him new artistic propulsion. Then there was his more elegant compatriot, Tolstoy, with his effortless prose and ability to capture the outer and inner lives of his characters with equal clarity and describe the grace moments that broke into their lives, no matter how tragic their circumstances. Not luck or coincidence, but grace as it appears in nature, unexpected, unexplained, and undeserved. Then came the bleak French atheists, particularly Camus and Sartre. At least they took God seriously enough to dismiss him properly. And how stylishly they did it, especially Camus, who, as well as having the courage of his convictions, smoked gitan. He seemed able to describe the reality of his existence and say life is merciless and cruel, and whilst it is punctuated by beauty and wonder, let us not attribute that to God, let alone a God who comes to us in person. It was a staring contest with God, and God blinked first. And all this achieved not so much by philosophical argument as through story, written in tight, crystal prose. Here was a writer ready to give reasons for his utter lack of hope, and do it gently and respectfully. I wanted to write fiction of my own. The trouble was I wasn't a genius Russian or a cool Frenchman, and I hadn't picked a deist god of philosophy or one of those sexy Greek gods of fate, or the absent god of Beckett. While Sartre could, in good faith, write, God might as well not exist for all he shows of himself, I believed in the God who had shown up. How do you write about the God who shows up in a world that has assumed he died a long time ago or has grown largely indifferent to him? And what publisher would be interested? I'm not sure Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John would get a book deal now. Imagine, "Dear John, apologies, but your manuscript did not come with any other name. Thank you for sending us the Gospel of John. It is certainly a bold book and caused a bit of a stir here at High and Mighty. There is real poetry in it and no little incident. But the stumbling block for us is your main character. Whilst compelling and brilliant, he never really feels quite human enough. And ultimately, it is asking a lot of a reader to accept the central premise that he is, in fact, God. After no little debate, we have decided to pass. Inevitably, someone will snap it up and make mugs of us all when it becomes a massive worldwide hit. We are open to seeing anything else you might write in the future. The apocalyptic story you mentioned in your covering letter sounds promising. We wish you well in your writings." When I started to write what would become the Testimony of Taliesin Jones, I had no expectation of it being a book people might read, just a feeling of having nothing to lose and wanting to leave some kind of mark. I wasn't sure how I was going to describe the ineffable or make the supernatural natural, but as in faith, so with writing, you work out how to do it as you do it, and some understanding comes in the telling. I found that story was, for me, faith's best language. We take leaps of faith, and we make leaps of imagination. What was hard to convey in argument was better expressed in story. You could smuggle deep truths into people's souls via the Trojan horse of the imagination. Perhaps inevitably, I started writing about a boy who experiences a physical healing as the result of prayer, feels compelled to tell the world about it, and has his fledgling faith tested in the face of indifference and then hostility. The writer, Anais Nin, said we write to taste life twice, in the moment and in retrospect. In creating a version of my present self, who had come to faith as a boy, I had the mysterious sensation of wondering, in retrospect, if the God I'd come to believe in had been there all along, that my childhood had been Christ-haunted. The physical healing in the story was a kind of parable of the spiritual healing my younger self was looking for. And writing the story became an imaginative redeeming of this past, an experience I would have again years later in writing The Killing of Butterfly Joe and remembering my pre-faith self selling butterflies in glass cases in America. After Taliesin, I wrote a second novel called Jesus and the Adman, with Christ as a perhaps too obvious haunting presence. The truth is, I was still trying to work out how to write. I was no longer using words to sell products, but to try and get beneath the surface of things. I was also working out what I believed. It turns out that faith is not about a single decisive event, but what one theologian describes as an ongoing response to the creativity of God's action and love in the world. But there was still a long way to go on this pilgrimage. In fact, we are now about halfway, and this is where the ad break would be. So please take a sip of your imaginary tea. Episode 4. We like it dark. It is 2010. I am 46. The years are whizzing by with the deceptive ease of a film dissolve. I am married to the girl who gave me that Bible. We have 2 kids and a green VW Golf 1.6 with seat warmers. And I've written a couple of novels and several TV scripts and film, and been doing Thought for the Day for 10 years. People are still reading novels. Cinema has not been killed by DVD, and we are living in a golden age of television drama. There is demand for content, and writers are now content providers. Bada bing. The world is in worse shape than predicted. September the 11th unleashed forces that were still playing out. Extreme forms of religion, with their us and them theologies, are on the rise. The banking collapse suggests that for 99% of us, unchecked market forces are not good news. I still believe in the reconciliation plan and I am being asked to play some part in it. For all its awkwardness, a place called church carries the vital message, and is not so much a building as a body of people. I'm also realizing that while my faith may be personal, it is not private. An internal coherence of faith can't hold without an external coherence. It has to make sense in the world as is. In 2005, we made a 9-month journey as a family to places affected by the HIV/AIDS pandemic, having been asked by the Salvation Army to bear witness to their work in Africa, India, and China. As well as the horror of a cruel pandemic, we saw a level of poverty from which we had been sheltered. The question, where is God in all this, had to be asked again and again, and there were no easy answers. In all this, a place called church had to work as hospital and rehab rather than courtroom. People were treated as patients in need of healing rather than convicts waiting to be condemned. And we began to see that while the world was in very bad shape, it was somehow being held together by small acts of kindness. George Eliot puts it this way, that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been, is half owing to the number who have lived faithfully a hidden life. The first commandment in script writing is show, don't tell. Perhaps it is the same with faith, and St. Francis was right. Sometimes praxis is better than exegesis. Saying yes to that journey opened the door to another and the writing of a script called Africa United, an against-the-odds story of 5 kids who walked 2,000 miles from Rwanda to get to the first African World Cup, led by an HIV-positive orphan called Dudu. And against the odds, Pathé made the film. The world was my ostrich, as Dudu says in that film. But by now, I was negotiating the practicalities of writing being my day job, and discovering that there are all kinds of pressures on a writer to write other words, other scripts, other books. The pressures are financial, artistic, sometimes ideological. They can come from your publisher or your agent or even your kids, such as my then 14-year-old daughter, Agnes, who asked, "Dad, why don't you write a film like Die Hard?" To which I said, "Darling, I'd love to write a film that good, but writing Die Hard is harder than it looks." A friend once put it more bluntly, Rid, just park the God stuff and you might actually have a few hit records. But you can't just write what you think other people want. Listening to that chorus can bend you out of shape. You must write what you can and what you can get away with. And I was beginning to believe that seeing the world with faith's eyes was a liberation for a writer rather than a restriction. One day I was asked to pitch ideas to a television production company. Before I began, the producer said with great portent, "We are really looking for something dark. Can you do dark?" I said I could do dark. After all, a person of faith has to take the problem of evil seriously. Evil usually has something to say about God, like the chatty demons who recognize and react to Jesus quicker than his own disciples, and the demon-possessed girl in The Exorcist. In Bergman's film, The Seventh Seal, the knight says to the witch, who was about to be burned at the stake, "I want to meet your master." When she says why, he replies, "Because I want to ask him about God. He, if anyone, must know." I had a good go at dark, working on the TV series Silent Witness, enough for a friend to ask my wife if she was worried about sharing a house with me. My first episode involved a motiveless murder spree with a die-hard level body count. I even snuck Jesus in as a clue to the crime. But in the end, I could only think of so many ways to kill people. And after 2 seasons, I was beginning to wonder if I was just part of a machine designed to keep people, in T.S. Eliot's words, distracted from distraction by distraction. Crime pays, though. I still get royalties from that series. In the end, the real question was, what are you going to say about the problem of evil in the world, and does your faith story have anything to say about it? Of course, it's not all spinning heads, serial killers, and violent crime. There are many things to write about. The messy fallen glory of humanity was enough to be getting on with. Again, I didn't have to look far from home to find it. When my father told me the story of his family sharing a house with a German family in the aftermath of the Second World War, I couldn't ignore the obvious dramatic potential, a situation where former enemies lived together and tried to build their lives in the rubble of a true evil. I wrote an outline and stuck it in a drawer, where it stayed for a few years, until my agent, one of those people a writer needs, someone who has more faith in you than you do, suggested I write it as a novel. Writing the aftermath was itself a kind of double redemption, returning to the house in Hamburg with my father, revisiting the German family he'd shared the house with. A good story retrieved from history and the bottom drawer, given another life, both in the moment and in retrospect. And proof that on this pilgrimage nothing is wasted. Another truism that became a post-it note on my computer. In faith, if faith is hoping for things you cannot see, there are few creative endeavors that illustrate this better than filmmaking. It is a kind of miracle that any film, good, bad, or ugly, gets made. So many things have to come right. How does a one-line premise get from your head to screen and appear fully formed as though ex nihilo? Perhaps the greatest satisfaction of having a book made into a film is seeing it give gainful employ to so many. I've never felt so useful as when I saw the canteens feeding the 400 on the set of The Aftermath. Another reminder that, as with faith, creating something is not a solo sport. Episode 5, God Bothering. We flash back to 2000. A letter comes from the BBC asking me to try a run on Thought for the Day, or the God Slot, as it was affectionately known back then. The letter came with some guidelines. Write about 400 words on something in the news through the prism of your faith. Don't preach or say anything that might offend. Give enough theology to satisfy the remit. Be true to your faith while remembering most people listening don't share it. There is no we on Thought for the Day. Write as though addressing one person, even though it's going to go out to up to 5 million. Be ready for feedback. Expect criticism, maybe even hostility. Don't give up the day job. I said yes, taking the view that it was not so different to writing stories. You have to win your audience over, make them care, render faith imaginatively and truly whilst dealing with people's innate resistance to it. The main difference being that you have 2 minutes, 45 seconds to do it, or about two tube stops on the district line. And despite a nervous start, I passed the audition, including a thought about the conflict erupting in Bethlehem. 25 years on, and thought remains a constant in my life, and I am grateful for it, certainly not for the money, but for the opportunity to remind myself every time what it is I believe, and to test it out in the world as is. There's still a challenge to write. It is its own form, part mini-meditation, part mini-essay. It is written to be read out loud, so it's good to choose words for sound as well as meaning. Sentences have to roll, syntax has to soothe, but then snap. Paragraphs have to fit together. It's a tough little construction. And if the form is tricky, the greater challenge is the content, how to see God in the unfolding news stories of the day and make these connections for people, half listening, half caring, and fully annoyed. I try to put myself in the shoes or slippers of a morning listener who has other things on their mind and whose tolerance levels go off like a Geiger counter upon hearing the name of Jesus. It's not everyone's cup of tea. Plenty of people complain it's too religious. It's not religious enough. And they write, "Dear Mr. Brook, please stop ruining my mornings banging on about your special friend. Dear Mr. Brook, I have worked out your thoughts are all basically me, Jesus." They had a point. At least that's funny. The more hostile responses come from the religious, who tend not to be funny. They often quote scripture at me, against me, and sometimes over me. Many of their letters are written in green ink. If anything, the pushback makes you work a little harder at the words. God botherer is a derogatory term, but it contains another meaning, namely that there is a God worth bothering about, a God who is, whether we are bothered about him or not, bothered about us. And that is still a piece of good news worth sharing with one person or 5 million. I would often run my thoughts by my former script editor on Silent Witness. Silent Steve was, still is, an atheist, and he was my imaginary tough crowd. He once gave me some advice, which became another yellow post-it note on my desk. Rid, just make sure you keep talking about the shit in the manger. Episode 6, Slouching to Bethlehem, Stumbling to Jerusalem. It's 2022. I'm nearly 60. History feels like it might actually be coming to an end. A pandemic that usually happens to other people happened to all of us. We are not becoming less violent. Truth is what you want it to be. The world is hotting up. The ratio of bad news to good is still at about 9-1, and our story seems to be accelerating to its bloody and brutal season finale. A friend asked me, "Still have hope for the world, Rid?" Despite the state of things, damn it, I do. I still believe that a great Redeemer is guiding us pilgrims through this increasingly barren land, but it is getting harder to give reason for your hope in all the heat and noise, especially in Jerusalem, where I was now living. I had been given a writing residency at St. George's College, a centre for pilgrims coming to the Holy Land. One day I was sitting at a cafe in the Muslim quarter of Jerusalem's old city, trying to write a novel. My favourite muezzin was giving the call to prayer and putting his voice through what sounded like a massive reverb pedal. Pilgrims carrying a cross up the Dolorosa step aside for the river of Jewish ultra-Orthodox coming the other way. After all, it is their town too. For Christians, this is the room where it happened. It is where you might come if you want to confirm your faith in the particular God who had friends, a mother, a first name, and a postcode. You can see the places where he spoke, the pool where he healed the paralytic, the tomb where he was buried, still empty, by the way. You can argue, and people do, about exactly where X marks the spot. But something significant happened here, and you can feel it. You can also feel the forces that would kill this God of yours in the tensions of an occupation, the animus, the clash of believers, and the sectarian squabbles, claims and counterclaims. This is the prophet-killing city. Terrible things have happened here, and on the ground, people are saying terrible things are going to happen again. Meanwhile, I am hearing other versions of a gospel being peddled by people with loud amplifiers, and their gospel is not for everyone. It divides people into the good, them, and the bad, not us, where the bad need to be punished by the Jack Reacher God or a Judge Dredd Jesus. It feels like the screaming preacher is driving the train, yelling words like reckoning and apocalypse. The Israeli satirical novelist Etgar Keret said, "A word is a lot." And he should know. In this place, words kill, and words get you killed. In Hebrew, the word for word is the same as the word for deed. One word can cause a lot of good. Another can level a city. As I write, I feel I need to choose my words carefully. This place doesn't need my anger, and I don't want to add fuel to this fire. But the words I'm writing feel a bit incendiary, a bit closer to the edge. Some of the chapter headings, Apocalypse Wow, CSI Galilee, Jimi Hendrix Muezzin, Holy Sepulchre Cubage, are not going to get past the sensitivity readers. Perhaps I might be going crazy, like those crazy prophets of old. I wonder if I have Jerusalem syndrome. Then again, as another Edgar says, at the end of King Lear, the weight of these sad times we must obey. Say what we feel, not what we ought to say. Again, I take heart from that prophet, Kurt Vonnegut, who, when asked how he approached his writing, said, "I want to stand as close to the edge as I can go without going over. Out on the edge, you see all kinds of things you can't see from the center. Perhaps the best response to all the madness is to hold up a crazy mirror to it at an angle, in the hope that you catch enough light to glimpse something true. As I sit there, filtering the noise, I think I get the title for the book. A year later, back in London, I have had to set the novel aside. Those prophecies predicting something bad was going to happen have come true, and everyone is reeling from what has unfolded since October the 7th. I've been asked to write the sermons for Holy Week at York Minster, and I'm wondering what the last days of Jesus have to say about where the world is heading. Does this story still bear the weight of these sad times? And how do you retell a story that has been retold 1,000,000 times in fiction, film, and thought? How to picture him when your mind is filled with Zeffirelli's blue-eyed Messiah, Pasolini's grumpy Marxist Jesus, or the greatest satire on religion ever written, Life of Brian, which I like to imagine as God's favorite film. Am I just adding more words to the great Golgotha of words buried outside the city walls? Looking for inspiration, I went back to Mark, the first gospel I ever read, and it was as fresh and startling as it was when I first read it. There is no fat on his prose. He could have filed this copy to Reuters. He really sounds as though he was there, bearing witness, holding a steady cam just a few yards away from his subject. And so I follow in Mark's footsteps, which follow in the footsteps of Jesus, and try to imagine being there in the moment without knowing what happens next. This close up, I see that this faith is built on a very precarious endeavor indeed. It teeters between triumph and tragedy. It runs the risk of no one ever knowing about it, no one ever reading about it, of being a total failure. This is a God who simply won't force himself on us, even if it kills him. When I had finished writing the sermons, I stole a title from Marquez, and I called them Notes on an Execution. I realized, though, in a way, I have written Die Hard. And I'm still on this stumbling pilgrimage, following the author and perfecter of my faith, with my notebook and shaky camera, trying to catch a glimpse of the good news and share it with whoever might be listening. I should say that I have come to the end of the lecture, but the good news, dear listeners, is that this story doesn't end here. The end is to be continued. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Ellen Clark-King. I'm the Dean of King's College London. We have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions. I would ask you to remember that Rhidian was the only one invited to lecture tonight, so please do keep your questions concise and questions rather than statements. We have a wandering microphone at the back there so that everyone can hear you. So please do ask whatever you would like to ask of Rhidian. And right at the front here.
Thank you so much, Rhidian. That was totally compelling listening. I loved your novel, Aftermath, which in your lecture you said was some kind of response to evil, and certainly set in that terrible situation in Berlin after World War II. When I read it, I didn't see any obvious theology in it. Could you tease out where you saw the theology in that novel about that terrible period just after the Second World War?
Thank you, Richard. The only other man who's done Thought for the Day longer than me. I think the obvious theology to me is obviously to do with the balance between reconciliation and the need for reconciliation and the need for justice, and how do you work those two things out in a situation where obviously an incredible evil had occurred, immense destruction had occurred, and forgiveness, really was what put it all back together again. The reconstruction of Germany is something of a miracle, that it happened at all, that it happened as quickly as it did. But in the mix of that, there were people who needed to be convicted and denazified, and so there was a really difficult balancing act. And the British, in particular, in their zone, were dealing with immense kind of destruction, and most of the bombing had occurred in their zone. When my dad told me the story, the thing that made me want to write it was that my grandmother hadn't seen my grandfather for a long time, and he'd requisitioned his house. And she went out, and she hadn't been told that they were going to be sharing the house with a German family until she got there. And she was really resentful of that, because they were still the enemy. But they lived there for 5 years, and my father, actually, who was 9 and 10 at the beginning of that process, was like the sort of icebreaker between the two families. So I just thought this is a marvelous setup for, a story. I did my own thing with it. I had to go somewhere else with it to write it. I didn't really want to write a family memoir. But I think, reconciliation and forgiveness and justice and how you balance those things.
Thanks, Rhidian. With a lot of crazy stuff going on and bad stuff, massacres and wars going on, how does that make you think about your faith? Do you ever think, if there was a God, why would God allow this? Or I just wondered how seeing trauma makes you feel about your faith.
Well, as I hopefully sort of said a little bit in the lecture, the journey of faith is living in the world as is, and you have to constantly ask the question, does this square up? Does this story stand up? What does God have to say to this? My own conviction is that the God I believe in is the God who enters into that craziness and suffering and destruction and transforms it, potentially. And I have seen that. It's not all bad. It's very easy to say everything's bad. And, as we experienced on that trip with the Salvation Army, what I probably didn't say in the lecture was just how much joy we found on the ground, and how much faith we found on the ground. So I think, it's constantly tested, and it's, as you say, right now it's feeling like it's been tested more than ever. And being in Jerusalem, as I said, in the room where it happened, it's sort of baffling because you're there in this place where, your God came from, and you're looking at it and you're thinking, wow, has this got any better in the 2,000 years? And the honest answer is, well, no, but something's happening. There is still transformation occurring. There are things that are happening. We just can't see it all the time. We see the bad stuff. We don't see the good stuff. So sometimes you have to go and find the good stuff, and you have to tell people about it. So being a witness isn't just witnessing disaster. It's witnessing those sort of hidden things, the more nuanced, subtle things that are, as I quoted, the George Eliot, the hidden lives, because that's often where faith is operating.
If you would like to, could you share something from your travels that broke your heart and something that gave you joy?
I think seeing the orphans in Soweto who were They were all orphaned by parents dying to HIV. And they did this dance. And that dance was just so incredible. It was so full of anger, hope. I don't know why I'm singling it out, but that's what's popped into my mind, just seeing those young men who've lost their parents, trying to do something beautiful, do something creative. Many joys. I mean, again, in Kenya, when we were living in that village in Kenya, every other woman was called Agnes, which was quite helpful for us, having an Agnes. And there was a very beautiful, she was like she was the chief's wife. She was called Agnes. And she was just a beautiful woman. And I remember, I think I did a thought for the day about this, where she walked into our house where we were staying, and she had a glass of water, and she made everyone stop, and she just thanked God for this glass of water. And it was just, wow. But it was joyous as well. So yeah, those are the two images that come to mind.
I think Jamie down the front and then the lady in the middle.
Thank you, Rhidian, so much. You mentioned about how you came to faith as somebody who was a young adult, effectively, with the hinterland, the echo of childhood, but also about the power of the imagination in stirring and sustaining faith. I wonder if you can reflect for us a bit on the imagination of children and how the imagination of children might be a very fruitful sort of primary ground for theology.
Yes. Well, the imagination, I think, is faith's first language. I don't know that we can really... I think faith's very hard without imagination. I think children instinctively get that. But there's this sort of make-believe tag that goes with imagination, which becomes problematic later, when you go, well, I put that in that category over there. I put the God stuff in the category of fairy tale, which is, I think, what I did without really thinking about it. I think that's what I did. And then later sort of obviously reviewed that. So when I wrote the book, I was trying to remember, well, what was my 11-year-old self thinking? Because I think the imagination you can make incredible leaps. You can even describe God in a way that's hard to do with an equation, say. So, yeah, it's absolutely vital. I mean, it should be, you can't separate it from faith. Not for me.
Thank you, Rhidian. I wasn't aware that you were such a fan of the action film and action hero. You mention everyone from Die Hard through to Jack Reacher. Who would you say that God was most akin to as an action hero, and why?
Oh, that's a tough one. Well, none of the action heroes, I think. I mean, as I say at the end of the lecture, having to go through the last week of Jesus, doing those sermons, I really had to think about that story in a way that I hadn't really thought about before. And it's sort of the antithesis, really, of the action hero, what happens. So I don't know that there's an equivalent to that. I think that's the God I'm following. That's what God looks like. Obviously, cultures and faiths think that God maybe looks like an action hero. And certain language makes you think that, and certain sort of things that are done in the name of God might make you think that. But I don't think that's the God that walks the walk. as it were. So I can't, sorry to duck the question, but I can't give you an answer to that, other than the obvious hero.
And we have time probably just for 2 more questions, so down the front here, and then... So 2 more quick questions.
Thanks. So nothing is wasted, and maybe you can't discover there's a pearl without eating the oyster. What advice would you give to your grandchildren about how to grow up, and what are the boundaries by which they might live in order to gain the sorts of freedoms and faith that you've found?
Wow, that's a big question. I don't know I can answer that question. Yeah, you've brought the proceedings to an end, I think. I think it's something to do with freedom and being free to think for yourself. I mean, with faith, it's hard. If you have faith and you raise children, in a family where there's faith, you have to make decisions about that. My personal belief is that you can't give children revelation. You can't give them that. That doesn't come from you. It comes from the Lord. And that's my experience of coming to faith. So if you trust that, then it's back to the coercion God versus the non-coercive God. I suppose my quick answer to your question would be, it's letting people be free to make up their own minds to encounter that God, because unless they encounter God for themselves, it's going to be a second-hand, by rote experience, which isn't really faith.
Thank you. You referenced George Eliot a lot in your talk, in your storytelling, and I was thinking about Silas Mana and his journey to faith, and I wondered if you drew any parallels with your own journey to that of Silas Mana.
Silas Mana was a book I absolutely hated. It was like, I reread it later and I really, really loved it. But at school, it was just a chore. It was like, who is this awful man? Which, of course, is the point. But I'd like to think I'm not remotely like Silas Mana in any way, except that I came to see what the pearl was, if you like. That would be my only comparison. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here with us this evening. If you haven't signed up, you can get a copy either by email or even in an old-fashioned printed form of Rhidian's fabulous lecture. But thank you most of all to Rhidian for a delightful, witty, wise and thought-provoking lecture. I think your speaking and writing are a part of many people's pilgrimages and part of picking them up and keeping them going. Telling good news in a way that people can hear it is a great gift and more necessary now than probably ever. So please keep smuggling deep truths into people's souls through the Trojan horse of the imagination. Keep speaking to us. Thank you so much.